HRN listeners. As we celebrate our 15th year, we are deepening our commitment to giving voice to the next generation of food systems storytellers, and we need your help. Our internship and fellowship programs help activate new possibilities for underrepresented and underestimated young people through experiential journalism, audio engineering, and production training. Through these unique programs, HRN helps food equity stewards build essential workforce readiness skills that expand their potential and foster economic mobility. Please consider supporting these critical programs. And with a minimum donation, you can be entered to win a dinner for two at an amazing restaurant in one of 8 cities and tickets to a concert at a great venue in one of those cities. We have incredible partners across the country who have donated, as they also share our passion for helping to educate the next generation of food systems storytellers. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. And make sure you donate before March 31st. Thank you.
My Family Recipe is a new podcast from Food 52 and Heritage Radio Network, bringing you cherished heirloom recipes and the stories behind them. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. It's Tuesday, November 9th, 2021, and this is a special show we're recording with the authors of the World Atlas of Beer, the 3rd edition, Tim Webb and Stephen Beaumont. And what's great is that back in 2012, when the 1st edition came out, we recorded together with Mr. Bobo from Chimay in the basement of my old Jimmy's number 43. So we've got a lot to catch up on, and let's introduce yourselves. Tim and then Stephen.
Hi, I'm Tim Webb. I'm a co-author of the World Atlas of Beer, and I do various other things in beer. Too many to mention.
And Stephen?
Stephen Beaumont here. Regular listeners will, I hope, remember me. I think this is my 3rd or 4th time on the show. Been writing about beer for about 3 decades now, and a bunch of books, and I love the New World Atlas. I cannot be more proud of a book than this one.
And I'll say I have a wonderful copy in front of me. You know, a lot of books now I get on Kindle, I read online, but this is a book that I really wanted to have in print, and it's going to make a great holiday gift if you're a beer fan or you have a friend who's a beer fan. World Atlas of Beer, it's kind of in the spirit of the old Michael Jackson books with great photos and things. But, you know, the one thing now is, like, what does it mean to be a beer writer? In sitting with us are 2 of the top beer writers in the world, and I'm just always flattered to get to talk to them. So why don't we start with Tim and Stephen? Just tell us how you got started writing about beer, you know, the Précis version, and another noted book that people should know you by. Tim?
Well, I started off as a beer consumer. In Europe, one of the big differences between Europe and the Americas is that we began to get national groups of beer consumers who were very concerned about what was happening to beer. We're talking about the last quarter of the 20th century. And I got into it through that and the writing really factual books, pub guides, things like that, to the UK, and that kind of then expanded, and it reached a point where we needed to expand into something else, and so we took a look at various other countries, and we took a look at Belgium, and through complicated things, I ended up writing the Good Beer Guide to Belgium, which was ran to about I think we did 9 editions in total. And I spent about 25 years doing it. And it was, though I say it myself, it was a unique book that was including every brewery in Belgium, all the beer styles. And to this day, I think it's the best ever cafe guide to the whole of Belgium ever written. And that's where I was at when I met Steve. Steve, do you want to do your career up to the point we met? And then we can talk about
Certainly, certainly. My précis version is very simple. I took a degree in university in political science, and you do three things when you study political science. You talk a lot, you write a lot, you drink a lot. So it kind of set me up well for this job. I wanted to become a writer, and having no formal writing training, I kind of went, okay, well, what do I do here? And the answer was specialize. So I decided to specialize in writing about beer, and got myself a column in the largest circulation daily in Canada. And it was a bi-weekly column. I ran that for about 3 years, brought out my first book, and then kind of slowly expanded my horizons from Canada, the United States, to Canada, the United States, to Europe. And then Tim came knocking on my door with the idea that we co-authored the World Atlas of Beer. So all of a sudden, it was the world.
Yeah, I mean, a lot's changed in whatever it came out 9 years ago. I'd rather talk about this book now because I still think that it's quite amazing that you're on your third edition. Is this really a brand new book because so much has changed?
Oh yeah, I think it. When we did the first edition, there were about 25 countries that had got an active beer culture, and we were saying when we wrote it that compare that to Michael Jackson's World Guide to Beer, which was actually the same publishing company and in many ways the same format as our book. We were saying back then, oh, that's written for a very different world, because in Michael's world there were four, the world that Michael was writing about back in the 70s and 80s, there were 4 countries that had still got a beer culture going for them, and all of those were fading. And there was a few other countries that got a few breweries left over, and that was about it. So back in 2012, we have 25 countries, and there's another dozen or so that are showing a few signs of developing. Now, when we do this edition, we've got 45 countries that are vying for space because they've got such interesting beer cultures, brewing beers. I forget how many countries have now got 100 different breweries. I think it's something like 35. I've got 100 breweries in them. Quite a few now have got thousands of breweries in them. And then if you look at the countries that are coming on and developing some beer culture, you're up into 3 figures. I think we counted 100 and I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's about 110 or something that we've got.
No, it was actually higher than that, Tim. It was about 125, I think it was.
Yeah, 125. Yeah, that's it. And there you're not talking about countries that they're importing a bit of beer to drink. These are countries that have already got a few brew pubs, a couple of craft breweries, etc. There's not much of the world left where alcohol is legal to drink, still for craft beer or beer culture to conquer.
And Stephen?
Well, it's, I've actually just been tasked by our publicist to kind of get an idea of exactly how much of the book has been rewritten from the second edition. And I would say it's in excess of 80%. I mean, we really kind of pulled the whole last edition apart, said we can't write it like this anymore because there's just too much to cover. So we started breaking things down in different ways, getting very excited about some young beer scenes that are just developing so incredibly quickly. And as we said, there's at least a line or two on over 120 countries around the world. Some of the dramatic changes from the first edition, you got countries like Mexico, which was, basically just getting out the gate. There may be a couple of dozen breweries back in 2012. There are around 1,000 breweries in Mexico now, and a lot of them are damn good. So it's really neat to go through the book and see how far everything's come since the second and first editions.
Do you think there's a correlation between countries with good beer and countries that have like a middle class? Because it seems like Mexico is kind of rising all around, and Brazil is rising, at least in their middle class.
Well, it's kind of tempting to make that kind of generalization, and you're absolutely right about Brazil really got going in craft beer when they had their mini economic boom. But then you look south of Brazil to Argentina, and Argentina is just in and out of recession like every year. Their economy is crumbling, and they have I think the second largest number of breweries in Latin America. And actually, COVID, we did update the book for this edition that included a lot of stuff about the effects of COVID. And one of the funny things was that it started making Argentinian craft brewers more money, because prior to COVID, 80 to 90% of Argentinian craft beer was on draft. And of course, when bars got shut down because of lockdown, they had to pivot into canning their beers, and they found out, hey, you know what? We make more money from cans than we do from draft. So it's actually made the industry as a whole more profitable.
Yeah, I think over in Europe, the equivalent of the emerging middle class is when the wall came down, 30 years ago now, you'd got quite strongly centralized economies in the east of Europe. These are breaking through now, becoming certainly the Central European nations of Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary don't want to be seen in the same image as those countries that are still in Eastern Europe as they see it, like Belarus and Moldova and a few others. But you're seeing both there and in the Baltic states and the southern parts of Eastern Europe, you're seeing craft beer really taking off. And it is kind of mirroring a younger generation coming through who don't have their parents' view of this kind of single social group country. They are much more individualist, and part of that, I think, is the craft beer scene is coming as part of that changing in the way they see themselves.
Yeah. Looking towards the future and everything, Tim, you had a great quote in your intro. It's like looking glass to the future. You said struggle of big beer, constrained trading versus craft beer, triumph of the human spirit. You want to talk more about that? It seems like you guys are going in that direction, the human spirit.
It's difficult trying to find words to summarize the beer scene. The beer scene in some ways, okay, it's changed a great deal in the last 30, 40 years, where it was quite possible in the late 70s through to probably the mid 80s. It was possible to predict that the whole of small-scale brewing would disappear from the planet. That is certainly not happening anymore. We've got, I think it's about 30,000 breweries now. Europe, for the first time in a century, has got more than 10,000 breweries. And that's fine. But that whole market is a minority. And if you look at the other part of beer, which is global brewers, they've still grown. The individual companies have grown much bigger. The number of companies has shrunk. They're getting much more monotone. And so you've got these two parallel versions of beer going on. But if you look carefully at it, the very big breweries are slowly but surely losing market share. The big brands are shrinking a bit in their biggest markets, and they're relying for continuing on there being growth in what for them are relatively new markets like China, India, to a certain extent South America. Africa is, they think, the big coming one. They haven't got anywhere else to expand into, and they haven't yet figured that big beer is quite boring. It's there's nothing wrong with it. It's a cheap form of alcohol if that's what you want, but it's quite a tedious product. Whereas craft beer is in danger, if anything, of becoming too interesting. And you've got these contrasting worlds, and you've then put them through a mill of problems that include COVID. I think you had COVID over in the US, didn't you? Yes, I'm sure you did. Yeah, but bad joke. But it's you've got COVID, and the next one you got coming up is mitigating climate change. These are massive changes in the world, and I think the challenges facing small breweries and huge global breweries are very different. And I'm not sure the assumption that big will win through is necessarily true anymore.
Yeah. Well, you guys are getting a little too macro view for me. Let's go way back. Like, let's say when Michael Jackson wrote his version of this book, is it similar to like what there was the old, before deregulation of telecoms, you had the big phone companies and you didn't have a lot of innovation. But I'm trying to imagine a world where the only way to get a brewing system would be you'd have to work through a giant company, right? I mean, you couldn't buy even a homebrew setup somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, just as COVID was, the point at which it struck was, it was getting very interesting in Europe because there had started to be a recognition that the big guys really needed the small guys because the small guys were the people who were making beer sexy again. They were capturing the imagination of younger drinkers, people under 50. They were also starting to get in, they were becoming part of the hip culture. Beer drinking was one of the things you did for the first time in decades. It was a really fashionable thing to do, and top quality products. So the big guys need the small guys. The small guys, on the other hand, let's be realistic, they don't get the share of the market that they should do if things were done purely and simply on the basis of quality. If the best products won the market, then craft brewing will be doing even better than it is now by quite a long way. But they were realizing they had to talk to the big guys and kind of negotiate with the big guys and somehow get a presence within the big guys' world. And that was starting to get really interesting in Europe towards the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. Then came COVID, and it's just like slam dunk reset, let's start all over again. And so we've now got some really interesting things happening as to what's going to happen in the future, coinciding with everybody talking about changes of climate change. So it's
sure. Tim, on just back to that quote, use the term I love because where are you in the UK? In Bristol?
I was in Bristol when I wrote the book. I've now moved about an hour down into the rural southwest. So I'm in the middle of nowhere here. I have my next door neighbor, and the nearest house beyond that is about half a mile away.
Yeah. Well, you use the term constrained trading. Now, translate that for us to American, because you use trading as a different term.
Yeah, I mean, if I explain the system in the UK, but there are equivalents of this in most major European countries. But the system in the UK is that roughly 45% of the beer is sold in bars, hotels, restaurants, and about 55% is sold in shops, supermarkets, etc. And in different ways, in different parts of the business, large breweries essentially gain control over huge parts of the retail industry, be it shops or be it bars. And there's lots of different ways in which this is done, and some of it is seen as being decent business practice, some of it is pretty dubious. But the thing is, it's all joined up, and it makes it very difficult in reality for a new small brewery that sets up, or even one that's quite well established and a decent size, to actually get their beers into local supermarkets, many local pubs, because they haven't got the freedom to sell in there through one of 1,000 different ways. So constraints on trade happen in subtle and clever ways, but are actually massive. It's something like 85% of the market remains with just 5 companies, at least 4 of whom are doing the same as each other.
Yeah. Hey, I'm going to jump to Stephen. Stephen, some more of your backstory. On your website, it says drink tourism. You mentioned an background as an actor and working on cruise ships.
Yeah, well, that goes back to what you were saying earlier on, Jimmy, is when you're a beer writer today, you have to explore all avenues. Unfortunately, the printed word is, the entire time I've been a writer, it has been in steady decline in terms of its value. I often get paid less now for an article than I did 30 years ago. So, you know, you do what you can. I've done a lot of speaking engagements. I never was a working actor, but I trained as an actor, which I think helps me in doing some of these presentations and shows and stuff. Actually very excited about next week going to Quebec City and presenting to a live conference for the first time in 2 years. So that'll be something a little different.
Oh, great. What's that, Stephen?
It's the Association of Quebec Microbrewers, their conference. And they've asked me to come along, and I said, absolutely. I get on a plane and go someplace different. 100%.
Yeah. Stephen, the last episode you were on earlier this year, you were stuck in Toronto, and it was one of my favorite episodes of the year where you just had your Toronto friends on.
Yeah, and you know, this is you try to see the bright side of everything, right? In a typical pre-COVID year, I'm on the road traveling probably 3 to 4 months in total. During COVID, obviously that's been completely curtailed. And what that's made me do is kind of look in my own backyard. And I've been able to really see, you know, with very, very clear eyes and in a way kind of looking at the whole thing new all over again, how far both Toronto and Canadian beer has come. I truly think that the city I live in, Toronto, Ontario, is now one of the top ranked beer cities in the world. And I cannot be more impressed by the advances that Canadian beer has made as well in terms of general quality and your ability to find great beer almost anywhere you go in this vast country.
Yeah, no, it's really great. I'm going to quiz you guys about the book now, okay? We're going to make this sexy, all right? So let's get sexy, guys. Quiz you on the book. For Stephen and Tim, what would be your beer to define the summer of 2021? Because for many of us, COVID restrictions were lifting, people were doing things again. What's a beer, either the specific beer or beer style, that to you resonates with the summer of 2021? Yeah.
Well, for me, beer is it. So you carry on, Steve.
Okay, I've just got to say Svedný Lesák, what we would generally call Czech-style Pilsner. Especially in my home market, there's been this huge explosion of Czech influence in breweries around here. And it's really been lovely this summer, drinking just one great lager, Pilsner style, after another. So that would be the style that I'd say that defines 2021 to me.
Oh, that's a good one. I was gonna say also Italian style pils. I know you guys covered a little bit of Italy, and you had Birrificio, the Tipo pils. Does anyone want to talk about how that beer seems like Tipo pils influence a lot of at least American brewers this year?
I think there's a general feeling that blonde lagers have got to reach their potential in the craft beer sector. In the UK, we have a second problem. We didn't just have COVID. We have this thing called Brexit, where the UK voted to leave the European Union and have a bash at being a private economy again, which hasn't gone that well. But one of the things that has happened is that the import-export of beer across the borders has been really slowed down because they haven't got the paperwork sorted. So for us over here, we've been focused very much on drinking beers from the UK because it's so much more difficult to access foreign beers than it was. And lager have hit us as well. So, but it's British brewers trying to brew a lager from somewhere. And there are some British brewers breaking with all traditions by doing decoction mashing and things like this. And they're importing particular types of hops that are typical to this lager or that lager. So yeah, we've had a summer of lager. Italian lager hadn't really got a grip in the UK before this, and it hasn't. I can't honestly say it's gone now, but there's lots of companies imitating Bavarian and Bohemian lager, some with some success.
Yeah.
Well, JB, that the style that you refer to, which I touch on in the Italian section of the book, the Italian style Pilsner, the question that I raise is it a style? I mean, Birrificio Italiano was certainly not the first brewery to dry hop a Pilsner. I'm quite positive that's happened before them. But when Matt Brindleson over in Firestone Walker kind of caught hold of it and said, Tipo Pils is my inspiration for Pivo, that was when the American imagination caught hold of this Italian style Pilsner. It's much like the Belgian style IPA, which was never a style in Belgium until the Americans decided it was a style. And then Belgian brewers started saying, "Oh yeah, this is our IPA." The Italian Pilsner was never a style in Italy until it became a style in the United States. So the question is, does that make it a style when it wasn't really a style in his home country? So I don't know. I leave that one hanging in the book. I don't try to answer that question.
Well, I like the Italian style pills, and a lot of brewers got creative this year with giving it Italian and pizza names. It was pretty fun. Hey, back to the book, beer history. What the hell? This great intro section. What the hell is ancient craft meets modern science?
I think that was
the book in front of me. Tim. Come on.
Yeah, you've got an advantage over me. I thought I haven't got the book in front of me. That seems was that in the UK section or was that was in the intro. A lot of things. This was in the 19th century, I think we're talking about when a lot of things changed regarding the technical understanding of beer and technical advances in brewery equipment and all the rest of it. And you had, I think you had the golden age of beer creation was from about 1870, shall we say, maybe a little bit earlier, through to the beginning of the 20th century. There's a few decades where you'd got the best of old-fashioned ingredients and pretty straightforward business methods, and you'd got machinery developing at a great rate, and that was a real change in how beer was looked at. The history of beer is you could either look at it really closely, or you could just stay up there in the clouds and look down on it. If you do the latter, you see that most beers were sort of brown and made in small quantities and sold from the brewery, whatever, until about, really, porter was the first organized beer. Porter was the first beer that became extremely popular originally in the UK, but that spread quite a lot around the world. Then came pale ales, which became fashionable because of changes in technology, changes in a lot of changes in infrastructure, where it was possible to ship hops a lot easier and ship completed beer a lot easier. And then, of course, you got the third wave, which was the lagers in the 20th century. But I think that's what we were talking about. You're not going to tell me I've just gone on about something.
That was a good one. All right. And then another one. Who is a separate off book, since we're talking England, who is the notorious blogger who researches and posts 19th century brewery recipes?
That would be Ron Pattinson.
Yeah, unquestionably.
Ron is a wonderful guy. He lives in the Netherlands. He's a British expat. He's very popular among homebrewers because he takes these ancient recipes and makes them homebrewer friendly. And he loves nothing more than sitting in a brewery's archives and poring over all these old recipe books and files and journals. And that's his idea of a great vacation. And God bless him for it.
Yeah, the world needs Ron Pattinson. Somebody's got to sit there and dig deep into old records, and with a passion that will ensure that they are the key parts are recreated honestly and straightforwardly.
I knew him from when Dan Paquette was in the States. Pretty Things. You know him now as St. Mark's of the Desert, up in northern England. But he used to make a lot of Ron Pattinson recipes. And I also, back to your beer history in your book, you guys mentioned using the letter K to describe a certain kind of beer. What was the letter K about? And then I'll tell you the beer that Dan Paquette made.
Well,
using K's.
There is the old system of X's. A lot of people have heard of these, where the beer was a 1X or a 2X or a 3X, basically is a measure of strength. The second dimension for beers for a couple of hundred years was how long they were kept for at the brewery. How long was the brewery conditioning, usually in oak? And that was also designated in the same way. It was 1K, 2Ks, or 3Ks. And the K stood for keeping. Quite as simple as that. So a 3K beer would be probably in the brewery for 18 months, 2 years. 2K would be a year or more, and a K would be 6 months, but not the full year, approximately. So yeah, that was the case. That was the K system.
Yeah, I never forget. Based on a Ron Pattinson recipe, Dan Paquette made. It was 3Ks, and it was like an 8%. It was dark. It was very hoppy. I guess it was supposed to be like a late 19th century 3K beer.
Yeah. Well, they were still making 3K beers at the beginning of the 20th century in the UK. There was a change in the law. A lot of the thing about development of beers, it frequently comes after there is a change in the law, and it's often an unintended consequence. So in the UK, up until about 1870, loads of beers were kept at the brewery and brewery conditioned in oak for quite a long time. It was a routine thing to do. But then they changed the taxation system on beer. And instead of being taxed, or one of the key parts was instead of being taxed when the beer left the brewery, you were taxed within a week or two of it completing its fermentation. So to keep a beer hanging around for 2 or 3 years was all of a sudden a very, very costly thing to do because you'd already paid the tax on it. So that was the real reason that these long matured beers disappeared. It wasn't anything to do really with, it wasn't primarily to do with changes in taste. It was that the prices went up both for the brewers and also for the customers, went up massively.
Jimmy, if I could interject just for a quick second here, Jimmy, because you're talking a bit about the history section of the book, and this is part of what we had to really rework the book, because let's face it, every beer book has the same stuff. It's like, here's the history of beer, here's how beer is made, here's what beer styles are about, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the challenges that Tim and I face every time we bring out an edition of this is to make it fresh and make it not the same old thing that you can see in, dozens of other beer books. So we were trying to take a different tact on these things and really kind of look at the history in a different way, look at the process of brewing beer in a different way, start to, add perspective from what a brewer would think looking at these subjects. And that's where you get something a little different at the start of the third edition of World Atlas. It was inspired a bit by my late father, who, of course, I gave him copies of all of my books. And I remember him sitting down with me one day and saying, Steve, all of your books seem to start the same way. Do you really need all that? And I thought, you know what? you got a point there, Dad. So we started kind of thinking about how can we make this a little more interesting, a little different.
No, I love the stories. And, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a few minutes on Beer Sessions Radio. All right.
Good food is worth 1,000 words. This is Aarti Menon, and I'm delighted to share a new podcast with you, My Family Recipe, from Food 52 and Heritage Radio Network. Adapted from Food 52's much-loved column of the same name, the My Family Recipe podcast will bring its pages to life. Each episode of My Family Recipe brings you a cherished heirloom recipe and the story behind it, from voices across the world of food.
We'd open these tubs of dough and they would exhaust these incredible yeasty fumes, and it just smelled like nothing else. It was so intoxicating.
I'll interview writers and chefs, parents and children about what's passed down along with the foods that we know and love.
Chinese people aren't like born with a download on how to like velvet chicken. You know, like that's not something that just like comes to you.
Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, welcome back to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. Join us and become a member at heritageradionetwork.org. Food radio and over 12 years of amazing podcasts about food and drink and so much more. heritageradionetwork.org. All right. So Stephen and Tim, the World Atlas of Beer, 3rd edition. This is a fascinating show, and I know we can just keep talking. So for you guys, what was the biggest challenge of writing this book? I mean, and first of all, Tim, you're in England, and Stephen, you're in, Toronto. Is that how writers work now? Do you need to like hang out in the pub together? And
well, no, we kind of we met. We've known each other since 1996, and my oldest daughter lives in Ontario, so I have a family link there. And she was quite young then. I'd been over to see her, and I was hanging around for a couple of days in Toronto, and I go into this bar and I start talking to the manager and blah, 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 blah. And he said, "Oh, you need to meet Steve Beaumont. He writes the Canadian Beer Guide." So, and that's how we first met. So that's the reason we work. But actually, if you've been around for a time in the beer world as a writer, we get a lot of the same opportunities to network around the world, and we kind of meet up more than would be reasonable. Though having said that, I haven't seen Steve for 2 years. I think that's the first time since 1996 I haven't seen you since 2 years. But it's it's kind of I know we have the internet now, and we know between us we know all the people we really want to be talking about these countries, because we know. Well, we think we know they're the best in their countries, and it's network.
You guys are super great. Okay, let's go through some of your notes. You each picked a beer that you wanted to recommend. Stephen, you picked a Bière de Garde. You want to tell us about that one?
Yeah, this one, it was actually a toss-up because it's a beer I've never had before, and I'm quite enjoying it. It was delivered to me by a brewing company called Fenelon Falls Brewing, which is a town about 2.5 hours northeast of Toronto. And oddly enough, they delivered me some of their special, they call it the Brewers Reserve series. And at the time they delivered them to me, they were about 5 or 6 months old, which I thought was a really strange time of the life of a beer to give out samples of it. But in the case of the Bière de Garde, it's worked quite well for it. It's really conditioned quite nicely. There's that little bit of note of oxidization, which I think befits the style quite nicely. And I do enjoy this style. I don't think it gets nearly the credit it deserves. It's one of those beers that when it's brewed well and it's fresh, it's absolutely delightful. When it's brewed well and it's allowed to age a bit, it becomes effectively a whole different beer. So it's always fun to see one of these and be able to give it a try when it's had a little time behind it.
And it may I ask, because I'm just saying Bière de Garde from Ontario's Fenelon Falls Brewing. What's the color of it?
It's got a bit of that kind of coppery tinge to it that you get with a beer that has some oxidization. But it's in the main, it's a medium gold color. It's for a beer that's been around for a little while. It's holding its foam quite nicely, so it's quite pleasant in the glass.
Oh, great! And you mentioned you had a backup beer from another local brewery.
Yeah, you were mentioning early on, like the beers of the summer. Well, for me, the beer of autumn every single year is Fest beers, Märzens, however you want to call them. And I will buy anything that says Märzen Oktoberfest beer on the label, and I round them all up as soon as they start coming out in the fall. And so I've just got a few left, and this one is Anderson Brewing Company, which is out in London, Ontario, to the northwest of here, actually southwest of here. And it's kind of an old school Märzen, as opposed to kind of the new style, which is more honeyish and brighter golden color. So it's got some earthiness to it.
And Stephen, I know that the U.S. opened its borders, so I know that people from Canada can come to the U.S. Can people from U.S. like Buffalo, New York, cross over to Canada?
Yes, you do. You do need to provide proof of vaccination, but you can cross the border now. Yes.
Little local color. It must be. I can't imagine being one of those kind of borders. You know, there's places in New York called Thousand Islands where you've got hundreds of miles of border with Canada, and you've been cut off. It's crazy. But Tim, your beer, actually, the beer you were talking about, I think, was also in the original Michael Jackson book.
Yeah, I think it was. It's Traquair House Ale, which one of the common themes of all three editions of the Atlas is that I've developed my belief that Traquair House Brewery in Scotland should be claimed as the first craft brewery, in the sense that of the new wave breweries that began after the great lull in the 20th century. Traquair started in 1965 with the Laird of Traquair, who was it's a Scottish word that basically means lord, but lord of the manor. He returned home because his father died, and he took on the great estate of Traquair, or the decent-sized estate of Traquair and its house. And when he did so, he discovered a brewery there, and one of his, I believe they actually shared an apartment at university. There's a guy called Sandy Hunter, who was the head brewer at Belhaven Brewery, which was his family brewery. And together they reopened a brewery in the outhouse in Traquair House, and in order to brew a Scotch ale. Now, I
should interject here, Tim. It's not an outhouse in the North American term of the word outhouse.
Right. Thank you, Stephen.
Very important.
Should I wash my hands before or afterwards?
No. Oh, right. Okay. If I said stable, would that be a stable block? Does that translate?
Much better.
Stable,
yes.
Yeah. Maybe horses?
Okay. Well, it would have horses in it if it didn't have a brewery in it. But it's an extraordinary little brewery and it's a beautiful rebuild. It's not that it was closed for 12 months; it was closed for ages. It's the only brewery in Britain where all the fermentation continues to occur in wood, and they recreated Scotch ale. This one's 7.2% alcohol, probably lower end of Scotch ale. It's got because of its fermentation in wood, it's got very slight tinge of acidity to it, very subtle, but it works because otherwise this is a deep, dark, caramel-dominated beer. But I thought I should do it because it's kind of historic, and they don't put on it's not like you go down the drive into the beautiful Traquair House Ale, and there's Traquair House, and there's a big banner saying we were the first craft brewery in the world. I'm the only one who says it. But I actually managed to stay there. It's a beautiful, enormous building. And from the first part was the 13th century, and the last bit to be built was 18th century. And they have 3 letting rooms, and I stayed there in the summer overnight. I have to say I bought the beer at full price as well. They don't pay me.
You don't comp the writers.
Yeah, exactly.
Going back to the original, the Michael Jackson book, now you're making me think about, there was some brewery that may have been serving cask ale in one of his from 1980s or 90s edition. And it was a place where they said that you could only get there when the tide was a certain level and that you might get stuck there overnight. And there's a picture of just these old guys sitting there drinking beer. Somewhere in England. Do you know what place this was?
There are a few places like that. I'm trying to link one with a brewery in my head. We have. I know there was a hugely evocative picture of a guy drinking Adnams beer.
Adnams.
Yeah, it's that was actually the pub in those days. they fixed the problem, unfortunately. But the pub in those days was sometimes cut off from the town, and you could be stuck there overnight. The town council got a bit annoyed at that. They eventually fixed the road, so it's gone up market.
Well, that's the spirit. When I'm talking to you about England, I keep thinking, wow, you've got the pub where. So the road, would it flood? Is that what it was?
Yeah, it was. It was just a badly built road. It was sunk over the years, and they were too mean to sort of bank it up again. But now, Southwold, where Adler's Brewery is and where this pub is actually the town where the novel David Copperfield was based. And so it's got a lot of history, and it's now a very popular town with upmarket tourism, some superb restaurants and pubs. It's really quite classy. And so, yeah. They didn't think that stranding tourists, even in a pub overnight, was good for business.
Now people would pay extra for that, I think. Hey, Stephen, so for you, let's talk about the new world of beer, because what's a country or a place that you want to call out that's in the book?
Oh, definitely. I've said this time and again. I think one of the most exciting beer scenes in the world today is Mexico. Just phenomenal creativity going on there. And, of course, Tim and I, one of the things that we have to do for the World Atlas of Beer, because it's a big world out there and getting bigger where beer is concerned all the time, is we do have to divvy things up. And being based in the UK, Tim does most of Europe, and being based in Canada, I do all of the Americas. So some of the most exciting places for me are in Latin America, just because of. I have an essay in this edition of the Atlas. This, I think, is titled "Brewing the Latin American Way," and what it comes down to is Latin Americans have a different way of looking at brewing, especially when it comes to flavoring beers with other ingredients. And the best way I could put it is that if a North American is making a flavored stout, for example, they think of making a beer and then flavoring it with cherries or chocolate or coffee or what have you. Whereas the Latin American approach is to look at that flavoring ingredient as just as important as all the other ingredients. So they're more cooks than they are brewers in that sense. And the closest you can get to it is the way the Belgians look at their fruit beers. It comes along the same lines. And that's resulted in, things like the Mexican Imperial Stout, which, it's become very popular in the US to do mole-style stouts. But the Mexicans, frankly, do it a lot better because they know the flavors and they brew it with this kind of approach in mind. And the Catarina sours down in Brazil, which are basically kettle sours made with fruit. But the way that they make them, it takes away that kind of one note kettle sour style point and gives it a rounder, more complete character. So it really is exciting for me. And I'm looking so much forward to getting back down into Latin America again.
Oh man, I might meet you in Mexico. It's on my list. What about, like, we mentioned this Italian style lager? You didn't really say it was a style. What about Mexican lager? I mean, that's also become very trendy in the States.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. You talk to some brewers, and it's basically their take on the Mexican take on Vienna lager. So if you think of the Dos Equis Amber, and kind of it's this lighter amberish beer, has some adjunct in it. And some people will say that's a Mexican style lager. Other people say, oh no, a Mexican style lager is an adjunct lager that's brewed to be really light, but not light in alcohol. So it's a 5% beer that has a very light character. I think the whole style just does a complete disservice to Mexico, because there's so much, as I said, there's so much exciting beer coming out of Mexico today. And to have that country saddled with the idea of Mexican-style lagers, which, let's face it, most of them are pretty insipid. And they're made for people who want to drink Budweiser but want to do it with a craft beer label. And you know,
I'm lucky. I've been getting to know more of the like artisanal mezcal makers and things from Oaxaca, and I know the culture there. There's even some rising wine regions and chefs and everything. Oh yeah, I think Mexico is like fertile ground. Now let's go back to Tim. When you said when part of doing the Good Beer Guide to Belgium is that you may have had the most comprehensive list of Belgian cafes. In the book, I like that you guys near the end, you both picked your top 10 beer destinations. Why don't you each tell me about one? And I just want to say that I love that you guys are talking about places to drink in addition to what to drink.
Yeah. Well, it's always difficult. I mean, I wish I had the book in front of me and I can remind myself where I said. I can remember Steve's choices because they're really good.
Well, you're talking about Steve's.
The Bow Bar. I'll do one of Steve's, the Bow Bar in Edinburgh, which is a fabulous bar. It's actually not been a bar for anywhere as long as it looks like, but it looks like it's always been there. It's this long, deep, oak-paneled and mirrored bar which just has shed loads of beers and shed loads of whiskies, and it has very little, if any, background music. It's just there for conversation, and it's all primarily about beer, and that's a great place to be. But I can't remember my own choices. You'd have to remind me.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about Tim's choices because I do have the book in front of me. Couple of them I've been to. Of course, Bruges Biertje in Bruges in Belgium. Classic, absolute classic bar. He actually picks Jeu de Ciel in Montreal, which I didn't have room for in my list, but Tim got it in there. Macche Siete Venuti a Fa, aka the football pub down in Rome.
Yeah,
which is a terrific.
That's one that I've never heard of.
There's a little street. So they've actually got two bars. I went for the one that didn't do much in the way of food. It's really quite a grungy bar, but its beer selection is a mix of very few obvious beers and lots of really elite, but not particularly interested in selling them at $30 a bottle. It's all sort of fairly routinely priced and a very cosmopolitan crowd. But and it's just completely incongruous for people imagining drinking in Italy. It's usually quite a suave, sophisticated kind of a thing. And this is the exact opposite. This is a Roman grunge bar. And if you want something a little bit more sophisticated, you go up the way to a bar, which I can't remember the name of, 100 meters up the way, where they do some food and have an almost equally good beer list. So it's a great place to just hang out.
It's called Beer and Food.
That's the one. Beer and Food, spelled F-U-D.
Beer and Food. Yeah.
And beer is spelled B-I-R, yeah.
And the picture that accompanies Tim's list is of the football pub, and it really does capture the image of it because it's these blokes standing out front of it. There's graffiti on the walls. Everyone's just standing around in shorts and jeans and T-shirts and baseball caps. It's not exactly your sophisticated Roman bar.
Well, that's it. It's the modern Italy,
Yeah, and if you went in there really snappily dressed, they wouldn't look twice at you. It'd be fine.
Wow, man, this has been great. I got the book in front of me, and I can't even find. There's so many things in this book. I do like that you didn't focus so much on brewing technique, and I think you're right about when Michael Jackson first wrote his book, the idea of just showing people how to brew was probably revolutionary. I think Pete Brown was saying a few years ago that most people still just think that beer is a chemical. I mean, are people talking to you about ingredients more than they used to?
Oh, I think I've just completed a scripting a 6-part series on how beer is made, which is basically aimed at interested UK consumers. And I was thinking when I started, how on earth do you string that out for 6 episodes of 25 minutes? And by the time we finished, oh my God, we're clipping even basics away. But getting a huge understanding of how different brewers are now looking at even basic processes in completely different ways. Even the simplest thing can be done in 12 fundamentally different ways. To the extent that we're going to have another one of these world councils on how to define what a beer is, what constitutes a beer. But it's going to get a lot more complicated before it gets simpler. Even though I have to say I would predict in the future that beer will get a little bit less complicated. But hey,
I think the other thing we have to remember is that there are several levels of beer consumer. I mean, there are the beer cognoscenti, the people who know about beer and hunt for beers, and then there are people, and this is the vast majority of beer drinkers, who still have no idea what a hop is. They honestly do not know. They know that beer is hops and barley and water and yeast, and that's fine. But you've got these breweries that are bringing out Citra Madness and Centennial this and Azteca that and all this kind of stuff, and the average consumer is lost because they don't know what these mean. So there's this increasing gap between the people who do know and the people who don't care to know, and they're just confused when you try to assume that they do know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, there's places I go and, there's still that conversation. Someone likes IPA and someone likes lager and someone's going to drink Guinness Stout. I guess that's been progress if that's the average drinker, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think I mean when I'm even older than Steve, and I'm old enough to remember when beer was exceedingly dull and there were no alternatives to drinking industrial lager or some pretty lightweight ales, many of which were nondescript. And there was no choice. I think at least now people, they have the opportunity to reject a much wider range of tastes and flavors if they really want to stick with dull beer. And that is huge progress. And you do, even in UK supermarkets, you're seeing a range of beer styles, even if they're not routinely stocking the really interesting ones. It's spreading.
Yeah, you're going to go to a decent restaurant, not in a major city, and you're going to have a choice of a few different styles. Like right now in front of me, I'm spending more time in the Boston area, and there's a brewery called Wormtown, which has been dedicated to buying local craft malt. And I'm drinking a double IPA called Diner Car, but it doesn't drink like a double IPA, It's got great flavor and mouthfeel. So, wow, this is really cool, guys. Like I said, it was 2012. We were in person, talked about the World Atlas of Beer first edition, and now we're on the third edition. And it really is a brand new book. I'm going to make sure that people I know, if you like beer, get this for a holiday gift. This is really the book we've been waiting for. And Stephen, we really were waiting for this book, weren't we?
Yes. This is another effect of COVID. We released this book in the UK last year, but because of COVID, it never got published in North America. And so the upside of that is that it allowed Tim and I to hunker down in the spring and update for even further. So I refer to this as edition 3.1, the North American edition.
So this one, the North American edition, is the current edition. And I have it, and we're going to post a photo of the cover because it's so beautiful. The World Atlas of Beer.
Oh, yeah, we finished the UK edition just the last 3 or 4 weeks of finishing off the manuscript. Neither Steve nor I could leave our homes, which time when you're writing a World Atlas, it just feels wrong. But then for the US edition, they therefore understandably postponed it. And then in the spring, we had to, as Steve said, we had to rewrite it for post-COVID. But in both cases, we had to make predictions of what we thought would happen in the very early stages of something changing. I thought that the assumptions we made about the UK edition were actually remarkably robust. We have changed quite a lot, and we have updated things and changed things based on what happened in the first lockdown, et cetera, and what we can predict for the future. But the great thing is that the craft beer sector has weathered COVID really well. It's learned a lot of lessons. It's robust. And we all thought it was in danger of disappearing, but once again, it failed to do so.
No, let's not talk like that, because we're, like I said, whether they're lager fans or IPA fans or stout fans, they're all drinking craft beer. So,
yeah.
Guys, thanks so much, Stephen. Once again, I think we were talking earlier this year about doing this show, and instead we did the Toronto lockdown show, which was a really great one. So thank you. Big shout out to everybody. Again, World Atlas of Beer, 3rd edition. Put it on your shopping list if you're a fan of beer or you have friends who are fans of beer. I love this book, and I'm going to keep looking at it. We could talk more about this, but we'll catch up with you guys next time. Big shout out to our engineer, Armin Spengen. Thanks so much for joining me here on Heritage Radio Network, Tim Webb and Stephen Beaumont. I'm Jimmy Carboni. We'll catch you next time on Beer Sessions Radio. All right, guys. Woo! Thank you.
Beer Sessions Radio is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. For our freshest content, subscribe to our newsletter. Enter your email at the bottom of our website, heritageradionetwork.org. Connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at heritage_radio. You can also find us at facebook.com/Heritage Radio Network. Heritage Radio Network is a nonprofit organization driving conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place. And we couldn't do it without support from listeners like you. Want to be part of the food world's most innovative community? Subscribe to the shows you like. Tell your friends, and please join the HRN family by becoming a member. Just click on the beating heart at the top right of our homepage. Thanks for listening.